Stop. You haven't subscribed to the channel yet. Subscribe now. We have new stories every day. Now, let's go. The first signs of autumn painted the maple trees along Cedar Grove Avenue in shades of amber and rust as James Mitchell pulled into his driveway after another long day at the corporate law firm. His two-story colonial house stood as it always had, pristine white siding, dark green shutters, and meticulously maintained flower beds. Yet something felt off. A feeling had been growing over the past few months like a shadow at the corner of his eye that vanished when he looked directly. The silver Audi was already in the garage, which wasn't unusual for a Thursday evening. What caught his attention was Brian Thompson's black Ford F-150 parked in front of the neighbor's house. Again, the fourth time this week, if James was counting correctly. He sat in his car for a moment, fingers drumming on the leather steering wheel, as he watched Brian emerge from his house. Brian moved with the easy confidence of someone who felt completely at home. "Those new planters look amazing. The purple ones really pop against the house," came Brian's voice across the yard. James watched through his windshield as his wife appeared from behind their garage, gardening gloves on and a wide smile on her face. She was wearing those fitted yoga pants again, the ones that had become her standard attire whenever she was gardening. "Thanks, I wasn't sure about the color at first," Laura called back, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. Once endearing, that gesture now seemed calculated. "Come take a closer look. I could use a second opinion on the arrangement," Laura said. Brian didn't hesitate before unlatching the gate between their yards. "Don't have to ask me twice," he replied. "Sarah always said I had an eye for these things." The casual mention of his late wife should have added a somber note to the conversation, but Brian's tone remained light and playful. Even James's jaw tightened as he watched his neighbor step into his yard with the familiarity of someone who'd made the trip many times before. Finally, stepping out of his car, James collected his briefcase and laptop bag. The sound of Laura's higher, musical laughter drifted around the corner of the house. He closed the car door with deliberate softness and moved quietly toward the side gate. "You should come by more often," Laura said, her voice dropping to a lower register that James recognized from their early dating days. "I could really use some design advice for the backyard." "Too well. I'm always happy to help a neighbor in need," Brian replied smoothly. James could hear the smile in his voice, especially one that paired well with his taste in wine. James rounded the corner in time to see Laura playfully swatting Brian's arm. "That was one time. Thank you for helping me move those heavy pots," she said. "One excellent time," Brian corrected, his hand lingering just a fraction too long on Laura's shoulder as he steadied himself. "That Cabernet was outstanding," Brian added. They noticed James at the same moment, and he watched with cold detachment as they shifted apart. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by someone who had been watching a lot lately. "Laura, you're home early," James said, his voice neutral as he checked his watch. "It's 6:30. "Laura, same as always," he replied, his eyes moving to Brian. "Evening, Brian. Helping with the garden again?" "Just admiring Laura's work," Brian replied smoothly, though James caught a slight tension in his shoulders. "She's got quite the green thumb, among other talents," James noted. "Excuse me. I need to change. It was a long day at the office," Laura said, as James walked past them and caught the faint scent of her expensive perfume. Entering the house, he heard their conversation resume, slightly more subdued than before. Inside, James loosened his tie and moved through the house with measured steps, his lawyer's mind cataloging details like evidence in a case. Laura's phone lay face down on the kitchen counter, a new habit she'd developed. Her laptop was closed but warm to the touch, and a wine glass in the sink bore a faint lipstick stain matching her current shade. Upstairs in their bedroom, more details demanded his attention. The bed was made, but not with Laura's usual precision. The shower in their ensuite bathroom was slightly damp, the air still holding traces of her shower gel. A second shower in the middle of the day wasn't unusual after a gardening session, but combined with everything else, James methodically changed out of his suit. Every movement was controlled despite the anger simmering beneath his surface. 8 years of marriage, built on trust and promises, now seemed suspect. Every detail of their life together felt like evidence against the bond they once shared. The photos on their dresser caught his eye. Their wedding day, holidays, family gatherings, each one showing blissful smiles. When had that changed? When had Laura started looking at Brian the way she used to look at him? Through the bedroom window, he could still hear their muffled conversation punctuated by Laura's bright laughter. James pulled out his phone and added another entry to his notes. October 3rd. Brian's truck parked outside for the 4th time this week. Laura showered midday again, wearing new yoga pants and expensive perfume. Physical contact observed. Shoulder touches, playful swats, extended garden conversation, change in vocal patterns. He had been documenting these observations for 3 weeks now, when the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Laura's behavior had shifted subtly at first. More time spent gardening, increased attention to her appearance, mysterious errands that took hours longer than expected. Then came the constant, furtive text messages she always angled away from him. The signs were screaming for attention, but James needed more than signs. He needed proof. Setting his phone down, he walked to their walk-in closet and reached for the high shelf where he kept old electronics and cables. The weekend cleaning project he'd been planning would give him the perfect opportunity to go through everything thoroughly. If there is evidence to be found, I will find it, he vowed. Suddenly, Laura's voice called from downstairs. Do you want to grab dinner? I was thinking we could try that new Italian place. James closed the closet door quietly. Sure, he called back. Give me a few minutes. In the reflection of their bedroom mirror, James straightened his casual shirt and smoothed his features into a mask of normalcy. He was good at masks. It came with being a corporate lawyer. But beneath, his mind was already plotting and preparing for what he might find the next morning. Dawn broke gray with threatening rain, matching James's mood perfectly. He had lain awake most of the night, listening to Laura's steady breathing beside him, wondering how many times she'd shared their bed after being with Brian. The thought made his stomach churn. Over breakfast, Laura announced, I'm heading to the grocery store. Not quite meeting his eyes, she added, we're running low on everything. Need anything specific? James took a slow sip of his coffee. No, I'm good. Don't forget we have that neighborhood barbecue tomorrow, right? He asked. Of course, Laura replied, gathering her purse. I'll pick up some extra wine. Brian had mentioned he was bringing his famous potato salad, as always. James watched her hurry out to her car. The grocery store was 15 minutes away. Once her car disappeared down the street, James moved to the garage. It was time to start that cleaning project, and he knew exactly where to begin. Thunder rumbled in the distance as he methodically sorted through cardboard boxes. The acrid smell of old electronics and musty cardboard filled his nostrils as he worked. Each box revealed years of accumulated technology. Old laptops, tangled charging cables, defunct tablets, the archaeological layers of their digital life. His movements were precise and deliberate as he documented each item in a notepad. 3 hours into the project, his hand closed around an old smartphone. It had been used as part of his home security setup during his frequent business trips last year. Turning the device over in his hands, memory clicked into place. He'd installed a sophisticated security app before his Seattle trip, positioning the phone to monitor their living room. The professional security system he later switched to had made him forget about this impromptu solution. His thumb hovered over the power button. Laura had been gone for 4 hours now. Her grocery store excuse was wearing increasingly thin. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the button. The screen flickered to life, and the security app icon sat there, innocent yet potentially devastating. His legal training kicked in, reminding him that once he opened this door, there would be no closing it. Whatever I find, I must act, he muttered, tapping the icon. The app opened smoothly, revealing months of archived footage organized by date and time. James's hands were steady as he scrolled through the thumbnails, each one a potential landmine. Most showed empty rooms, shifting shadows, and normal domestic scenes. Then he saw it, a thumbnail from 3 months ago during his Seattle business trip. Even in the small preview, he could make out 2 figures on their living room couch. His finger trembled slightly as he pressed play. The footage was crystal clear, the audio crisp. Laura sat on their Pottery Barn couch, where they had spent countless evenings watching movies and sharing wine. Brian sat beside her, their bodies angled with intimate familiarity. "Are you sure about this?" Brian's voice came through clearly. "James isn't here," Laura replied, her hand sliding up Brian's arm with practiced ease. "He won't be back for 3 more days." James watched as Laura leaned in and kissed Brian. It wasn't a hesitant kiss. It was confident and familiar. Brian's hands tangled in Laura's hair as she climbed onto his lap. Their motions were synchronized. "We should go upstairs," Brian suggested between kisses. Laura shook her head, already unbuttoning his shirt. "No, I want you here," she said. A choked sound rose in James's throat as he forced himself to watch every moment of their betrayal. He saw them shed their clothes on the same couch where he had once proposed to her 6 years ago. He listened to their whispered endearments, their passionate sounds, and the creak of the couch springs. When it was over, as they lay tangled together, Laura traced patterns on Brian's chest with her fingertips. "I've missed you," she murmured. "These business trips of yours sometimes feel like a blessing in disguise." Brian kissed her forehead. "We shouldn't talk about him." "You're right," Laura replied languorously. James stopped the video, his hands shaking with rage. He quickly copied the file to his secure cloud storage and made multiple backups. Every movement was precise and controlled, even as his mind reeled from what he'd witnessed. The timestamp showed this was from 3 months ago. How long has this been going on? How many other times have they violated my home? He thought bitterly. The sound of Laura's car pulling into the driveway snapped him back to the present. Quickly, he pocketed the phone and composed himself as Laura entered the garage, struggling with grocery bags. He moved to help her, his face a mask of normalcy that took a while to form. "Oh, I ran into Sarah from book club," he commented mildly. Laura lied smoothly. "We got to talking about the next meeting." James noted how easily the lie fell from her lips. How many other lies had he believed? The next few weeks tested James's self-control to its absolute limits. He maintained their routine with mechanical precision, playing the role of devoted husband while gathering more evidence of Laura's betrayal. Every morning, he kissed her goodbye, tasting bitterness as he wondered if Brian's lips had been there hours before. Every evening, he asked about her day, noting how she carefully edited her answers. He became hyper-aware of every detail, how her phone was always face down, how she angled her body away while texting quick errands that stretched into hours, and how she always seemed to know Brian's schedule. During the neighborhood barbecue that weekend, James watched as Laura and Brian performed a carefully choreographed dance of casual interaction. They never stood too close or talked too long, but their eyes told a different story. "Great burgers, James," Brian said, raising his beer in a toast. "You've got a real talent for the grill," James replied tightly, imagining how satisfying it would be to expose the evidence in front of everyone. "Thanks, Laura," Brian added. His eyes flickered to where Laura stood, chatting with neighbors. "Yes, she is," James agreed, his tone pleasant while his hand tightened around his beer bottle. Later that night, as they cleaned up after the barbecue, Laura seemed distracted. "That went well, don't you think?" she asked, wrapping leftover burgers in foil. James watched her movements, noting the slight tremor in her hands. "Very well," he replied. Brian seemed to enjoy himself. Laura's hand stilled for a fraction of a second. "Did he?" she asked. "I hardly noticed," James murmured, already adding another lie to the growing pile. Each day brought new observations, new betrayals, and James documented everything meticulously while maintaining his facade of normalcy. Quietly, he consulted his lawyer, who approved his approach. Gather as much evidence as possible before making any moves. Then came the evening that would shatter their carefully maintained pretense. James arrived home to find Laura in the kitchen, preparing his favorite meal. The scent of honey-glazed salmon filled the air, mixing with the aromatics of roasting vegetables. Two elegant, tapered candles stood on the dining table, and an expensive bottle of wine breathed nearby. Laura only went to this much effort when she had news or a request. The last time she prepared this exact meal, she had been asking for his support in changing careers. "Welcome home, honey," Laura greeted him with a kiss. She wore the blue dress he had given her for their last anniversary, her dark hair falling in soft waves. "How was your day?" she asked. "Productive," James replied, hanging his jacket in the hall closet. "Yours?" "Oh, you know, the usual," Laura answered with a secretive smile as she moved back to the kitchen to freshen up. "Dinner's almost ready." James walked upstairs to their bedroom, his mind racing. What was she planning? Had she somehow discovered that he knew about the affair? No. If she had, she wouldn't be this calm or pleased with herself. Every movement was deliberate as he changed out of his work clothes. When he returned downstairs, everything was perfectly arranged. The candles were lit, casting a warm glow over the table. The wine had been poured into their best crystal glasses, a wedding gift from his parents. "Sit, sit," Laura urged, bringing the last dish to the table. "I want everything to be perfect tonight." James took his seat and watched as she settled across from him, practically glowing with excitement, a reminder of their early years before the lies and betrayal. "James," she said after they began eating, reaching across the table to take his hand, "I have something wonderful to tell you." He remembered how those same fingers had traced patterns on Brian's chest in the video. "What is it?" he asked. "I'm pregnant." Her smile was radiant, triumphant, with twins. The wine glass in James's free hand stilled halfway to his lips as the room seemed to tilt. The word twins echoed in his mind, accompanied by the haunting images from the video. "Laura," he said, his voice icy. "Honey, say something. We're going to be parents." He set his wine glass down with exquisite care, the soft clink echoing in the sudden silence. "Are we?" Laura's smile faltered. "What do you mean? Should we celebrate this news, or share it with Brian first?" Her voice wavered as the color drained from her face. "What are you talking about, Brian?" "Our neighbor." "James, Laura." Brian's voice interrupted. "You've been in our living room while I was away on business trips." James's tone was calm as he produced his phone and played the video. "Shall we review the evidence together?" he said, his voice low and determined. Laura's eyes widened as she recognized the footage playing on his phone. "You've been monitoring us," she cried. "It's the security footage. I forgot about the old phone until recently." James paused the video on a damning frame. "I suppose I should thank you for reminding me it exists." "Please." Laura's voice cracked with tears. "It was a mistake, one terrible mistake. The twins will need a DNA test." James stood, his chair scraping back. "If they're not mine, you can explain that to the judge during our divorce proceedings, along with this video." Laura's face turned ashen. "You wouldn't make this public, would you? Think about what that would do to our family." James's voice cut like a razor. "There is no us anymore, Laura. You ensured that when you invited another man into our home, into our bed, when you laughed about my absences with your lover." James stepped to the kitchen doorway, and then turned back, his voice cold and precise. "I want a court-supervised DNA test. No private labs, no chances for you to manipulate the results like you've manipulated everything else in our marriage." "James, please," Laura begged, mascara running down her cheeks as she reached for him. "We can work through this. Therapy, anything. Don't throw away 8 years of marriage." He jerked away from her touch as if it burned. Don't you dare speak of throwing away our marriage. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You threw it away months ago. Every time you texted him, every excuse you made to see him, every time you allowed him into our living room. Stop. Laura wrapped her arms around herself, shaking. It wasn't like that. Then tell me, Laura, what was it like? James's voice rose for the first time. Tell me how it wasn't exactly what I saw in that video. Tell me how you weren't calling his name on the couch where I proposed to you. Tell me how you weren't laughing about my business trips while he touched you. I made a mistake, James, she sobbed. People make mistakes. We can get past this. James laughed. A sharp, terrible laugh. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary, burning dinner, or even neighborly help. Laura, a mistake is inviting him into our home over and over again. He pulled out his phone again. Should we count those choices? I have the footage right here. Would you like to watch it together? Analyze every moment you chose to betray our marriage. Laura backed away, her legs hitting a chair. You're being cruel, she whispered. Cruel. James's voice dropped to a whisper. Cruel is watching your wife with another man on security footage. Cruel is sitting across from that man at neighborhood barbecues, knowing what he did. Cruel is you telling me I'm going to be a father when you don't even know if it's true. He advanced slowly, his presence filling the kitchen. Want to know what else is cruel, Laura? Checking the couch for stains before I sit down, wondering if you showered to wash them off, listening to you lie day after day. He paused. I never meant. Laura began, but he finished for her. It's obvious. You were so careful, always keeping your distance in public, always ready with an excuse. Did you enjoy the secrecy? The thrill of sneaking around behind my back? Laura slumped into a chair, her face in her hands. Please stop, she pleaded. Why should I stop? You certainly didn't stop when Brian suggested moving things upstairs. What was it you said? No, here. I want you. Right here, in our home. James's voice was relentless. Did you ever think of me at all? Or was I merely the convenient husband who paid the bills and kept up appearances? It wasn't like that, Laura whispered through her tears. I love you, James. Her voice cracked. Don't you dare say those words to me. You don't destroy someone you love. You don't humiliate them. You don't turn their home into a personal stage for your actions. He walked to the wine bottle still on the counter and picked it up with steady hands. You know what the worst part is? Not the physical betrayal, not even the lies. It's the intimacy. The way you traced patterns on his chest afterward, the secrets you shared, and how you turned my absences into your private jokes. James poured the wine slowly down the sink, watching the red liquid swirl away. The DNA test is non-negotiable. If those twins are mine, I want a divorce. No, I want one anyway. But let's start by establishing paternity. Laura pleaded. James, please, think about the children. He spun around, his control slipping. The children might be mine. They might be Brian's or someone else's. It doesn't matter anymore. Our marriage is over, shattered like the trust you destroyed. He stepped to the doorway. You wouldn't make this public, would you? Think about what that would do to our families, our friends. His voice was icy. There is no us anymore, Laura. You made sure of that when you invited another man into our home. She reached for him again, tears welling in her eyes. James, please. But he jerked away. Don't you dare speak of our marriage. You threw it away months ago. Every time you texted him, every time you made excuses, every time you allowed him into our living room. Laura's voice cracked. I made a mistake. People make mistakes. James laughed, sharp and bitter. A mistake is a one-time error. You turned betrayal into an art form. 3 months of footage documenting every single choice. Did you wash the sheets after he left, or did you enjoy making me sleep in what was left behind? The sound of her palm cracking against his cheek echoed in the quiet street. James did not flinch. He merely smiled coldly. Add assault to the court records, and my lawyer will be delighted. Laura sobbed. "What happened to the man I married?" "He died the moment he saw his wife with another man on our living room couch," James said, turning to the kitchen doorway. "The DNA results will tell the truth." He made a call. "Hello, yes, I need to speak with the lawyer I consulted last week. It's about proceeding with both a paternity test and divorce filing. I have video evidence. There's no chance of reconciliation. I want to begin proceedings immediately." Laura remained slumped in her chair, her sobs quieting to hiccups as she listened. The dismantling of their marriage was arranged with clinical precision. The candles on the table had burned low, casting long shadows across the ruins of their celebratory dinner. When he finished the call, James walked to the table and methodically blew out each candle. The smoke curled upward in the darkness like the last breaths of their marriage. "I'll sleep in the guest room tonight," he said flatly. "Tomorrow I'll start looking for an apartment. You can keep the house until the divorce is finalized." "I don't want to live here anyway, not after what you've done to it," he added. Laura tried once more, her voice small in the darkness. "Please, don't do this. Don't make it public. Think about our families, our friends." "Actions have consequences, Laura," James replied icily. "You are about to learn that lesson very thoroughly." He paused at the doorway. "One more thing. Don't warn Brian. Don't try to coordinate your stories. The video speaks for itself, and I have weeks of documentation backing it up." Thunder rumbled outside as James climbed the stairs to pack an overnight bag, leaving Laura alone in the darkened kitchen. Their 8-year marriage lay in ruins, shattered by betrayal and lies. There would be no forgiveness, no reconciliation, and no second chances. In the guest room, James sat on the edge of the bed, the phone with its damning evidence clutched in his hand. Tomorrow he would begin the process of legally dismantling their life together. Tonight, he would let his rage crystallize into something cold, sharp, and unstoppable. Laura's sobs still echoed through the house, but they stirred no sympathy in his heart. She had made her choices, betrayed their vows, defiled their home. And now she would face the consequences. The twins might be his, Brian's, or someone else's, but it no longer mattered. Their marriage was over. Outside, the storm intensified. James pulled up the video one more time, forcing himself to watch again. Each viewing strengthened his resolve and reminded him that there could be no forgiveness, no reconciliation this time. Their story would not end with simple betrayal. It would end with justice. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room for a brief moment. In that flash, James made his final decision. He would not only end this marriage, but ensure that Laura and Brian's betrayal followed them long after the divorce was final. They wanted to act like animals. Fine, let them face the consequences in the cold light of day, in front of everyone they knew. The morning after James's devastating revelation dawned gray and cold, matching the atmosphere inside the house. He emerged from the guest room at precisely 6:00 a.m., his suit perfectly pressed, his movements measured and controlled. The familiar scent of coffee pulled him toward the kitchen, where he found Laura waiting. She looked disheveled, mascara streaked across her cheeks, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Her hands trembled around a coffee mug as she watched him enter. The kitchen island stood between them like a barrier, the granite countertop still bearing the remains of last night's ruined dinner. "You didn't come to bed," Laura said hoarsely. "I wasn't aware our bed was still exclusively ours," James replied coolly. "It seems to have become more of a community space lately." "Don't be crude," Laura whispered. "Can we please talk about this like rational adults?" He turned slowly, coffee mug in hand. "Rational adults. Like when you rationally decided to let our neighbor into our living room, or when you laughed about my business trips being a blessing in disguise." His tone was bitter. "Stop it, Laura." Her mug hit the counter with a sharp crack. "Yes, I made a mistake with Brian, a terrible mistake, but you were spying on me. Do you have any idea how violating that feels?" "Actually, I do," James said, setting his own mug down with exaggerated care. I got quite an education in violation watching that footage. Would you like me to describe it in detail? The way you arched under him on our couch, the soft sounds you made, the way you traced patterns on his chest afterward. Please, Laura, she pleaded. I know I hurt you. I hurt me. James laughed sharply. You didn't hurt me, Laura. You destroyed everything we built. Every memory, every moment. Every room in this house is tainted now. Did you two have a favorite spot, or did you just work your way methodically through the house? He demanded. Stop throwing that in my face. What I did was wrong, but recording us without consent, that's illegal. James's voice turned clinical. It was my security system, which I informed you about when I installed it. Your adultery is the only illegal activity that camera captured. Would you like me to prove it? I have multiple backups, he said, tapping his phone. An email notification showed on the screen. My lawyer confirms the footage is admissible. She's quite interested in how it demonstrates your pattern of behavior. Your lawyer. Laura's face went pale. You've already talked to a lawyer. Unlike me, I believed in being prepared. James picked up his briefcase from the door. The DNA test is scheduled for next week. Court supervised, as I said. I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to explain all this to your parents. My parents. Laura's voice rose. You wouldn't tell them, would you? They don't have to understand. They just have to watch the video. I'm sure they'll get the picture. You can't do this. Laura. She lunged for his arm. Think about what this will do to everyone. Our families, our friends, Brian's reputation. James slowly peeled her fingers from his arm. Brian's reputation. You mean the grieving widower act he's been playing while sneaking around with you? Yes, I'm very interested in preserving that particular facade. What do you want? She asked desperately. Laura, his voice turned cold, if you ever loved me, you'd keep this private. Think about our families. My parents will be devastated. She cried. They don't need to understand, he replied icily. They just have to see the video. Don't you have rights? She shouted. Yes, you do, James said with a cold smile. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you exercise it until your lawyer advises you otherwise. With that, the door closed behind him with a final click, cutting off her protests. Outside, the morning air was crisp and carried the first hints of autumn. James walked to his car with measured steps, his mind already moving to the next phase of his plan. His phone buzzed with a message from Laura. Please come home. We need to talk about this. He archived it without responding. Evidence. Everything is evidence now, he thought. Throughout the workday, James's phone buzzed constantly with desperate messages from Laura. You're being unreasonable. Think about the children. The video is a violation of privacy. My lawyer will prove it. She pleaded. Our families don't need to know, she added, trying to manipulate him emotionally. Around noon, a message arrived from Brian. We need to talk. Man, this doesn't have to get ugly. James was in his office reviewing merger contracts when he received it. He typed back a single response. All communication through lawyers from now on. Brian replied immediately. Don't do this, James. Think about Laura's reputation. Think about what Sarah would say. The mention of his late wife made James's hand tighten around his phone. You should have thought about Sarah before you, my wife, on our couch or dishonoring her memory. Part of the thrill. Brian began typing, but James cut him off with a final message. Nothing about this is fair. See you in court. He then blocked both numbers. The damage to his concentration was done. Sarah's name echoed in his head as he remembered the funeral 2 years ago, how he and Laura had helped Brian through those first months. They had invited him over for dinner every Sunday, ensure he wasn't alone during the holidays. And this was how Brian repaid that kindness, by being with James's wife. Mr. Mitchell, his assistant's voice pulled him from his dark thoughts. Your lawyer is online, sir. Yes, James replied, picking up his phone. Sandra, what's the update? Laura's hired Rebecca Chun, Sandra said. She's already pushing for a private settlement. Not happening. I told her as much, James replied coldly. The DNA test is scheduled for next Tuesday at 9 a.m. Both Laura and Brian must attend. Perfect, James said, leaning back in his chair. Any other attempts at contact? Brian's lawyer called with floating numbers for a private settlement, but I'm not interested. Sandra's voice softened slightly. A settlement would be cleaner, faster. I don't want clean or fast. I want justice. I want everyone to see exactly what kind of people they really are. The court proceedings will be public record, Sandra added. Good, James said sharply. Let everyone see. Let them try to explain themselves in front of their families, friends, and colleagues. I want them to feel the same humiliation I felt watching that video. Sandra sighed. All right. It's your call. But be prepared. They're going to fight dirty. Let them, James replied coldly. I have the truth on my side, and hours of video evidence to back it up. In the following days, James stayed at the Madison Hotel downtown, returning to the house only when Laura was at work to collect more of his things. Each visit felt like walking through a crime scene. Every room held memories now tainted by betrayal. In the living room, he couldn't look at the couch without seeing Laura and Brian together. In the kitchen, he remembered Laura's celebratory dinner, her manipulation with the pregnancy news. Even the garden, once Laura's pride and joy, seemed like nothing more than a stage for her afternoon trysts with Brian. He documented everything meticulously, every text, every call, every attempt at contact. Laura tried different tactics. First came emails filled with tears and apologies. I know I hurt you deeply. Please don't destroy everything we built. The children deserve better. We can go to counseling and work through this together. Remember how much we loved each other. Then came anger. You're being vindictive and cruel. That video was a violation of trust. My lawyer says we can fight this. And finally, manipulation. If you ever loved me, you keep this private. Think about our families. Your parents will be devastated. James forwarded each email to Sandra without response. Let Laura try every trick in her arsenal. He had the truth documented in high definition with perfect audio. The morning of the DNA test arrived cold and clear. James stood in his hotel bathroom, adjusting his tie with precise movements. The man in the mirror looked older and harder, with colder eyes. Good, he murmured. I need that coldness today. His phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. Remember, stay calm, no matter what they say. Let them dig their own graves. James typed back a simple understood and headed for the courthouse. The courthouse steps loomed ahead. Weathered stone that had seen countless revelations. Laura was already there, standing with a sharp-faced woman he assumed was Rebecca Chun. His soon-to-be ex-wife was wearing the same blue dress from that dinner, her hand protectively over her stomach. The sight made his blood boil. Even now, she was playing the victim, using her pregnancy as a shield. Mr. Mitchell, with Rebecca Chun at his side, stepped forward. Before we proceed, I'd like to discuss handling this matter privately. Sandra intercepted smoothly. My client is clear. Court-supervised DNA test, followed by divorce proceedings. Your client is threatening to use the video as evidence, Rebecca argued. It was obtained without consent. The video was obtained through a security system I installed with your knowledge, James interjected. By all means, challenge it. I'm sure the judge will be very interested in viewing the evidence. Laura stepped away from her lawyer, moving toward James with pleading eyes. Please, can we talk privately for just a minute? There are things you need to know. The only thing I need to know, James said sharply, is the result of the DNA test. Everything else is just another one of your lies. Damn it, James. Laura's voice rose as she cried. I'm carrying your children, aren't I? James turned fully to face her, his voice arctic. That's exactly why we're here, to determine that. Given your extracurricular activities, we might need a broader test pool. Before Laura could respond, Heavy footsteps echoed down the marble corridor. James and Laura turned as Brian strode toward them, his suit rumpled, tie crooked, and face haggard. The grieving widower act was no longer convincing. "Mr. Thompson," Sandra said, stepping forward, "my client is done with lawyers." Brian's voice was tight with anxiety. "James, this is insane. We're neighbors, friends. We can work this out privately like men." James laughed bitterly. "Friends? Is that what you call men when your wife tells me she was the only one who understood you while you justified being with her on my couch?" Brian's face flushed red. "Keep your voice down, please," he hissed, glancing nervously at the growing crowd of onlookers. "Good," James said, stepping closer. "Let them see exactly what kind of man you are, the grieving widower who couldn't even wait for his wife's funeral to cool before sleeping with his neighbor's wife." Brian's face turned even redder. "Sarah has nothing to do with this, does she?" James pressed. "We took you in after she died, invited you to dinner, included you at the holidays, tried to help you through your grief. And this is how you repaid that kindness." "I made a mistake, Brian," he said, his voice cracking. "A mistake is when you forget an anniversary, burn dinner, or—" James's laugh was sharp and cold. "A mistake is something you do once. You and Laura turned betrayal into an art form. 3 months of footage, every moment of you two desecrating every room in our home." James's eyes narrowed. "Tell me, did you wash the sheets after he left, or did you enjoy making me sleep in what remained?" The crack of Laura's palm against his cheek echoed in the quiet street. James did not flinch. He only smiled coldly. "Add assault to the court records. My lawyer will be thrilled." Laura sobbed. "What happened to the man I married?" "He died the moment he saw his wife with another man on our living room couch," James said, turning back to his car. "The DNA results will come back tomorrow. I suggest you start preparing your explanation for when they prove you're lying again." Later that evening, a storm raged as Brian called again, his blocked number showing. "For God's sake, answer your phone." His message played. "This is getting out of hand. The whole neighborhood is talking. Think about what this is doing to everyone." James forwarded the message to Sandra, adding it to his evidence file. "Let them squirm," he thought. "The truth is coming, and no manipulation can stop it." The next day, Laura sent an email to both James and their lawyers. "I'm willing to sign a confidentiality agreement. Whatever financial terms you want. Just keep the video private. Think about our families, our friends." Sandra called immediately. "They're desperate," she said. "Good," James replied icily. "Let them feel what I felt watching that footage." Sandra reminded him, "Are you prepared for every possibility? The results may not matter anymore. Even if those twins are mine, this marriage is over," James said firmly. "I want everyone to know exactly why Brian did what he did." Brian approached James outside his office building. "This isn't you, James," he pleaded, looking around nervously. "The James you knew died in that living room." James replied coldly, "The man you see now has nothing left to lose. Think about Laura's health." Brian's stress was palpable. "Shouldn't you have thought about that before you brought your wife home?" James finished sharply. "Save it, Brian. I'm sure the judge will love your version of events, especially with the video as context." The day before the DNA results were due, Laura made one last desperate attempt. She waited in the driveway when James came to collect his belongings. "I'll tell everyone it was all my fault," she offered, her voice shaking. "I'll take full responsibility. Just please keep the video private." James paused, looking at her tear-stained face for a moment. He remembered the woman he married and the life they'd planned together. Then the image of her with Brian flashed before his eyes, and his heart turned to ice. "The time for deals is over, Laura," he said. "Tomorrow, everyone will know the truth, every dirty little detail." "Please," she whispered, "I'm begging you, like you begged Brian in our living room." James smiled coldly. "Save your performance for tomorrow. I'm sure the judge will appreciate your theatrics." He left her standing in the driveway, her sobs trailing behind him. Tomorrow would bring the DNA results and the beginning of the real destruction. For now, James savored their growing panic and desperate attempts to avoid the inevitable. The truth was coming, and neither Laura's tears nor Brian's pleas could stop it. At dawn, the October sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. James arrived early and watched from his car as the other players in this tragedy assembled. Laura's parents arrived first, her father, Richard, with a face set in granite, and her mother, Catherine, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. They had always loved James like a son, but now they could barely look at him. Next came Brian's sister, Margaret, her high heels clicking as she hurried up the steps. Once Sarah's best friend, she was there to support the man who had betrayed his late wife's memory. The irony wasn't lost on James. Sandra met him at the courthouse doors, carrying an extra-thick briefcase. Her navy suit and precise movements radiated competence and control. "Are you ready for this?" she asked quietly. "More than ready," James replied, adjusting his tie. "Do they know yet?" "No," Sandra said. "The judge has sealed the results until this hearing." Laura's lawyer had been calling nonstop to negotiate a private settlement, but it was too late for that. "They're offering significant money," Sandra noted, studying his face. James smiled coldly. "They could offer me the entire trust fund. It wouldn't matter. Some things can't be bought in a courtroom." Laura's parents took seats in the front row. Catherine's eyes were red-rimmed, and Richard sat rigid beside her, his jaw working as if he were chewing words he couldn't say. Then the courtroom doors opened, and Brian entered with his lawyer. He looked terrible, unshaven, suit wrinkled, eyes bloodshot. The grieving widower act was giving way to genuine fear. As Brian passed, he pleaded, "Please, one more chance to explain." "Save it for your testimony." James cut him off. "I'm sure everyone will be fascinated by your version of events, especially the part about honoring Sarah's memory." Brian flinched as his sister reached for his arm, but he shrugged her off and sat as far from James as possible. Laura was the last to arrive, and she made an entrance in a conservative black dress that made her look as though she were attending a funeral. Her hand rested protectively over her stomach, the perfect image of a wronged woman carrying precious life. "All rise." The bailiff called as Judge Harrison entered. His face was grim as he took his seat and signaled for everyone to sit. "Before we begin," he announced sternly, "I remind everyone that this is a court of law. Any outbursts or disruptions will result in immediate removal." He fixed each party with a stern look. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you prepared to hear the results?" Laura's hands twisted in her lap, the diamond wedding ring catching the light. "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered. "Mr. Mitchell." James nodded curtly, noting how Laura flinched at his silence. "Mr. Thompson." Brian's yes was barely audible, his face ashen. The judge opened a sealed envelope and reviewed its contents with an expressionless face. The only sounds were Catherine's muffled sobbing and the rustle of Laura's lawyer shuffling papers. Finally, Judge Harrison spoke. "I have reviewed the DNA results thoroughly. According to these findings," he paused, looking directly at Laura over his glasses, "the fetuses match neither Mr. Mitchell's nor Mr. Thompson's DNA." The courtroom erupted. Catherine's muffled sobs turned into wails while Richard surged to his feet, his face purpling with rage. "What is this? What have you done?" he demanded, pointing a shaking finger at Laura. "What have you done, Dad?" Laura began, but Brian interrupted. "You lied." He shot to his feet, shrugging off his lawyer's restraining hand. "All this time, all those promises, you were sleeping with someone else too, Mr. Thompson." The judge banged his gavel. "Control yourselves, or I will have you removed." Brian laughed, his tone edged with hysteria. "Go ahead. I'm done protecting your lies." He turned to Laura, who shrank in her chair. "You told me I was the only one." She whimpered. "That James was never home. That I was the only one who understood you, Brian accused bitterly. Is that the same line you fed to this other man? Laura's shoulders shook with sobs. James's laugh cut through the chaos like a blade. Oh yes, please explain, Laura. Tell us how you manage such an impressive juggling act. Was it a spreadsheet to track your various liaisons? The judge's gavel cracked again. One more outburst and I will clear the courtroom. Sandra stood composed amidst the chaos. Your Honor, given these results, we move for immediate divorce proceedings. Additionally, we request that all evidence be made public. Laura. James interjected. Would you like to tell them, or shall I show everyone the security footage? I'm sure your parents would love to see how you spend your afternoons when I'm away. No, James, please, not here. Laura begged, tears streaming down her face. Not the video. Her lawyer, Rebecca Chun, intervened. Please remain seated. The video is admissible evidence. Judge Harrison declared firmly, leaving no room for argument. Mr. Mitchell, you may proceed. Sandra connected her laptop to the courtroom display system. Laura's face went ashen as the familiar scene appeared on the screen. Her and Brian on the living room couch, with the timestamp clearly visible. Turn it off. Brian shouted, but the judge silenced him with a stern glare. The footage played with crystal clarity. Laura's voice was heard. James isn't here. He won't be back for 3 more days. Then Brian's response. Are you sure about this? Richard suddenly stood, pulling Catherine toward the door. They couldn't bear to watch their daughter's infidelity played out in public. Margaret's face twisted with disgust as she followed, and Brian called after her, Wait. But she only shook her head. Sarah would be ashamed, she spat, slamming the door behind her. There's more, James announced as Sandra paused the video. 3 months of footage, multiple encounters, multiple locations. He turned to face Laura, whose makeup was ruined by tears. Would you like to tell everyone about your afternoon gardening sessions, or should we review those too? Stop, Laura whispered, her voice breaking. Please stop. Why should I? James's voice was razor sharp. You didn't stop when I was away on business. You didn't stop when you desecrated our home. You didn't stop when you laughed about my absences with your lover. His tone hardened. Or should I say lovers? Your Honor, Rebecca Chun tried to intervene. This public humiliation serves no purpose. Silence. James cut in. It serves the purpose of truth. Let everyone see exactly who Laura Mitchell really is, a woman who not only cheated on her husband with the grieving neighbor, but managed to get pregnant by yet another man while doing so. And who is he? Brian's voice cracked, barely containing his fury. Who else were you involved with? Laura's carefully curated image of the devoted wife, sympathetic neighbor, and expectant mother shattered. She sat crumpled in her chair, expensive mascara forming dark rivers on her cheeks, her hand clutching her stomach as if shielding it. In a barely audible whisper, she mentioned the Chicago conference. Remember the Chicago conference? James's laugh was sharp. The one in July when you called me every night, telling me how lonely you were in that big hotel room. He turned to Brian. Was that the same week you were told she was visiting her sister? Brian's face contorted with fresh rage. You said you were in Philadelphia. This is interesting. James leaned forward. Different stories for different men. Tell us, Laura. How did you keep all your lies straight? Did you keep notes? It wasn't like that. Laura's composure finally broke. Mark understood me. Brian interrupted, surging to his feet. A convenient distraction. A neighborhood prop for your perfect wife act. Mr. Thompson. Judge Harrison warned. Control yourself. Brian spun to face the judge. I'll be thrown out if I don't get a chance to speak. Fine, he spat. But first, I want to know how long you've been playing us all for fools. Exactly, James said, his voice dangerously calm. When did it start, Laura? Was it Mark from Chicago, or did you start with Brian because he was conveniently located next door, a perfect cover for your afternoon activities? Perfect cover for my afternoon activities. Brian echoed. I never meant to. Laura started, then stopped as James interjected. Or to get pregnant by another man while maintaining two separate affairs. Which part wasn't true? The courtroom fell silent under the weight of her deception. Even Rebecca Chun looked uncomfortable as she shuffled papers. Your Honor, Sandra said sharply, given these revelations, we request immediate dissolution of the marriage and that the complete security footage be entered into evidence. Rebecca objected weakly. This is becoming a public spectacle. Spectacle? Let's discuss how my wife orchestrated this charade. How she used Brian as cover for her other affair. How she manipulated everyone. Me, Brian, our families, our community. James turned to Laura. Tell us about your schedule. How you managed to be the perfect wife when I was home, and an accomplice when I was away. Laura reached for him with trembling hands, but he stepped back as if her touch might burn him. Don't play the victim now. Every lie, every betrayal, every manipulation was your choice. Brian laughed bitterly. You used me, used my grief over Sarah, to manipulate me, to make me believe you cared. James fixed a disgusted look on Laura. How many times did you feed that line to different men? She sobbed. I'm sorry, she whispered. You used my love, my trust. James's voice was cold. Now everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are. Judge Harrison surveyed the wreckage before him. This court finds Mrs. Mitchell's conduct reprehensible. The DNA evidence, the security footage, and her own admissions leave no choice. Mr. Mitchell's petition for immediate divorce is granted. Sandra continued, we also move for full disclosure of all evidence as public record. Laura, James shouted, you can't make this public, my career, my reputation. Your reputation, he countered, the one you destroyed when you turned our home into your personal stage. Think of our families. Laura pleaded, turning to face him. Your parents, my parents, they shouldn't have to see this. They will, James said coldly. Every video, every text, every email documenting your betrayal will become public record. Let everyone see the real Laura Mitchell. Brian suddenly interjected. What about Mark? Doesn't he deserve to know about the twins? I'm sure Laura can handle that conversation, James replied bitterly. She's quite experienced at juggling men's emotions. Laura's lawyer made one final attempt. Mr. Mitchell, surely we can handle this more discreetly. Discretion died the moment I watched you with another man on my security camera. James snapped. Now everyone can see. Consider it a public service warning. Ignoring Laura's continued sobs of the courtroom doors, James gathered his things methodically. Goodbye, Laura. I hope the twins inherit their father's moral compass, whichever man that turns out to be. In the courthouse corridor, Brian caught up to him, his face haggard. James, wait. I need to say. Save it. James cut him off sharply. You're just another victim of Laura's manipulation. Go home, Brian. Just stay out of my life. Brian's face crumpled. I never meant to betray a friend who helped me through my wife's death, he whispered. Which part didn't you mean, Brian? James asked coldly. Without waiting for a response, James walked away, leaving behind the wreckage of betrayal. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Sandra joined him a moment later. The divorce will be finalized within days, she said. Laura's deception has expedited everything. Every piece of evidence is now public record. James nodded, his satisfaction settling coldly in his chest. Good. Let everyone see. What will you do now? Sandra asked. Move on, build a new life, James replied as he straightened his tie. Let Laura live with the consequences of her choices. Driving home to his new apartment across town, James reflected on the path of destruction Laura had carved through their lives. She had played them all, masterfully presenting the devoted wife, the sympathetic neighbor, the secret lover. Now her carefully constructed house of lies had crumbled, leaving only truth in its wake. His phone buzzed with a message from Laura. "Please, can we talk one last time? I can explain everything." James deleted it without a word. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to say. The truth had done all the talking. In his rearview mirror, the courthouse grew smaller, taking with it 8 years of marriage and a lifetime of trust. James felt no regret. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness. Some lies were too vast for redemption. Let Laura deal with the fallout. Let her explain to their families, their friends, their entire community. Let her figure out the twins' paternity with Mark from Chicago. Sometimes justice looked a lot like revenge, and sometimes that was exactly what justice demanded. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.